Hey, what's up guys? This is Oakley, and CA has released a couple more of these faction reveals, so we're going to be going over the Vandals. Here you can see what CA has given us, but I'm going to go ahead and cover a bit more of the information of the Vandals. So the Vandals themselves were a Germanic tribal group, originally located a little further north. People think around Scandinavia, and they descended into the Germanic area. There they were, part of a tribal group made up of actually two main tribes, the Hastingi and the Silingi. And overall, the migrating German tribes of this period were much more sophisticated than the Romans, enemies back in the day, the Suebi and stuff like that. They were sometimes the same people, sometimes there were other groups that had migrated. We don't really have much history of them because obviously they don't leave many records, so we can't really tell what the composition of these groups were. It's obvious that a lot of migration was taking place, and there's a pretty big difference if you look at the old Germanic enemies of Rome and the current ones. So the Vandals themselves, as I said, were those two tribes, but they're much more sophisticated than if you were to travel back a couple centuries and look around the area. They had better, clothing, armor, and also weaponry. This was to be especially true of the chieftains. This is something that's pretty well established in Germanic culture, but also culture, military culture at this time. Is when you have your leaders, obviously they're going to be decked out with the best equipment, and the Germanic and often barbarian way of fighting would be the chieftains would have their principal bodyguards around them, their warband, and these guys would be fully armored with the best equipment and all that they would often have from skirmishing, raiding, exchanging, trading, all that stuff. So you're going to see some heavily armed elite troops for the higher tier units. However, the rank and file of the Germanic armies would often not be as lucky as their more elite counterparts. So they'd have a lot of these light armed troops in the front who would serve as scouts. They would throw spears and whatnot. They'd be prone to skirmishing in the front lines. But then they would probably withdraw into a main line, and that's where you'd see the rank and file, as I said, of the Germanic and the Vandal armies form up and fight with the long sword known as to the Romans as the spatha, and then they would often be very happy to use a war axe that they could either throw or use in upfront hand-to-hand combat. Cavalry was also important to this faction, and a lot of the migrating tribes, to say the least, and that's why you see Rome actually recruiting a lot of them to be the auxiliary forces. So back in the day, you would have the Germanic auxiliary troops, and all throughout Roman's history they're always looking for auxiliary forces, so the Vandals and other German tribes are often going to be using these cavalry forces. As for the Vandals themselves, they fought with the Romans in the late 2nd century AD, and they ended up mostly settling around the territory of Dacia, and you can see that here in their starting position. Although it looks like they're not really in possession of a faction, they're more going to be in possession of what it looks like marauding armies or maybe small territories. I'm not quite sure what that right there indicates, but it's clearly not possession of a united territory. So it looks like it's going to be mostly war bands or migrating armies. If you want to look at the effect of the Vandals on the Romans, well, first you can look at them, the early conflict and their settlement, and the sort of blurred lines between Rome and the Vandals was kind of shifting, and it led to the rise of Flavius Stilcho. So he's a famous half Vandal, half Roman. His father was Vandal born, but was a Roman soldier, and Stilcho was born in 360 AD. He was formed as part of the, as I said, the Romans would draw on the Vandals and other barbarians as auxiliary troops. Well, he was able to work his way up the ranks and was eventually able to become Magister Militum in the Roman army in the West, and that actually, for a period of time, made him the most powerful man in the Western Roman Empire. So that's a very famous half Vandal for you. So you can see the integration of sort of the blurred lines, as I like to say, between the barbarians and the Romans. It's not really clear cut. There was a lot of interaction, especially on the border forces. But then you have the Huns who start to advance, and they put pressure on the Vandals, and the Vandals in response have to start moving westward. They're going to be confronted with the Franks to their west, and they'd been longtime enemies, and finally, as the Vandals are moving across the Rhine with the help of their allies, the Alans, they're actually able to defeat the Franks, and from there they push into Gaul in 406, and they take part in massive widespread raiding and looting, and they take a lot of arms and armor, and that's where you probably see these tribes who were, as I said before, the rank and file wouldn't have too much armor, but in the period of this raiding against, all these other tribes, they were sure to accumulate a lot of booty and a lot of money, and they would have been able to equip themselves to a much larger degree. Then after that, they start pushing even further south. By 409, they're going to be pushing into the Iberian Peninsula. They're going to fight over that area, and bringing with them the Alans. They're going to settle some of them into the area of the former Lusitani tribes. And then they're actually going to push down across the Straits of Gibraltar into North Africa and create a North African kingdom. So it's kind of crazy to think that in a period of, maybe a decade, they're going to move all the way from Germania all the way down to North Africa and form their own kingdom. Pretty crazy stuff. It just shows the pressure on these tribes to keep moving and and just the transience of any state or kingdom in this time period. You see them moving, hundreds of miles, even across the ocean, and all the while, they start off as being maybe not the traditional barbarians, but pretty. As I said, the rank and file would be pretty sparse in terms of armament, but you can imagine by the time they made it all the way to North Africa, they would have been totally transformed by their conquest, veteran, they would have had a lot more money, and so once they're in North Africa, they're going to be much more beefier troops, and they were actually able to take Carthage from the Romans, so it's a pretty interesting reversal where you have Rome actually trying to defend Carthage against barbarians, and then the Vandals set up their own North African kingdom. They become pretty powerful, and it's really interesting. If you look at the extent of their power, they're going to have actually probably the same amount of lands that Carthage did during the First Punic War, and then they're going to put pressure on Rome. So you have a really weird revival of the threat from the south. So it's very interesting history. And then eventually they're going to build a fleet and actually be able to contend with the Romans in the east and west, beat their fleets, and actually they're even going to sack Rome in 455. So that's the image you can see here at the end. But yeah, they probably would not have been, as I said, as bare-chested as you see here through all their travels. They probably would have been far better equipped by this point in time and much more heavily, veteraned and have a lot of the equipment. And I'm repeating myself. But anyways, if you want to get a better look of the enemies of Rome's and even the troops and armies of this time period, I got a lot of my information that I've just, lectured to you from a book called The Illustrated Encyclopedia of Uniforms of the Roman World. I highly recommend it. It comes with, hundreds of hand-drawn pictures depicting Roman troops, their enemies, their allies, all the equipment they had, and it's a very, very good book, and I shared a couple of those images with you, so hopefully you guys can pick that up. It's a great read, great book, especially if you're interested in this time period, and it covers all of Roman history, as I said, their enemies and their allies. Thanks so much. See you guys in the next video.